Hello everyone, welcome back to Beer HR. Grab your drink, pull up a chair. This is episode number 7, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Beyond the Buzzwords. We are going to discuss 5 major points in this episode. Point number 1, the difference between diversity and inclusion. Point number 2, measuring DEI impact. Point number 3, bias in hiring and promotion. Point number 4, psychological safety. Point number 5, why inclusive cultures outperform. Let's discuss point number 1, the difference between diversity and inclusion. And we will look at it why one without the other fails. Let me start with a simple image. Imagine you are hosting a dinner party. You invite people from different cultures, backgrounds, age groups, industries, and experiences. The table looks incredible. Different perspectives, different stories, and different energy. That is diversity. But here is the real question. When dinner starts, who gets to speak? Who gets interrupted? Whose ideas are acknowledged and whose opinions shape the conversation. That is inclusion. And this is where many organizations get it wrong. A few years ago, when Microsoft began transforming under Satya Nadella, the company didn't just focus on innovation, it focused on culture. Microsoft had already made progress in hiring diverse talent, but hiring alone wasn't moving the needle fast enough. What was a deeper issue? Employees from underrepresented groups didn't always feel heard, so Microsoft leaned into inclusion, manager training, growth mindset culture, psychological safety, accessibility initiatives. Nadella emphasized empathy as a leadership capability, and something interesting happened. Innovation improved because diversity brings perspectives, inclusion activates them. Now let's look at Pixar. Pixar has long been celebrated for creativity, but internally they realized that even with a talented, diverse teams, decision-making rooms didn't always reflect different voices equally. They had to intentionally create forums where feedback could be candid, like their brain trust meetings, where hierarchy is set aside and honest critique is encouraged. That is inclusion in action. It is not just about having diverse animators, it is about ensuring their ideas shape the final film. Because diversity is representation, inclusion is participation. Here is another angle. Johnson & Johnson didn't stop at tracking representation metrics. They began measuring belonging and engagement across a different demographic groups. Why? Because you can hire diverse talent. But if turnover is higher among those groups, you don't have inclusion. They discovered that inclusive leadership behaviors like fair decision making and transparent promotion criteria directly impacted retention. Inclusion isn't a feeling, it is a system. Let's break it down simply. Diversity asks who is in the room. Inclusion asks whose voice matters in the room. You can mandate diversity targets, you cannot mandate inclusion. Inclusion shows up in who gets stretch assignments, who gets promoted, who receives mentorship, who is sponsored for leadership. Without inclusion, diversity becomes optics. With inclusion, diversity becomes performance. At Accenture, leadership publicly committed to measurable diversity goals, but they paired that with accountability. Managers are evaluated not just on financial performance, but on inclusive leadership behaviors. Because here is the truth, culture changes when incentives change. Accenture recognized that inclusion doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. Now let's get personal for a moment. Have you ever been the only person like you in a room? Maybe the youngest, maybe the only woman, maybe the only person from a different cultural background. That is diversity. Now imagine speaking up and someone builds on your idea instead of ignoring it. That is inclusion. Inclusion creates psychological safety, and psychological safety drives innovation. Let's see the common corporate mistake. Many companies celebrate diversity hiring milestones, press releases, social media posts, annual reports. But what about internally? Meetings are still dominated by the same voices. Promotion patterns are still predictable. Feedback is still uneven. That is a diversity without inclusion. It looks good, but it doesn't transform performance. As the work becomes more global, remote, and cross functional, collaboration is everything. Companies like Google have conducted internal research showing that psychological safety, a core component of inclusion, is one of the strongest predictors of team effectiveness. Not IQ, not seniority, not even experience, safety. And safety is inclusion in action. So, bottom line is here's the simplest way to remember it: diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Organizations that focus only on diversity build varied teams. Organizations that prioritize inclusion unlock their potential because talent is everywhere, opportunity is not. And the companies that win the future won't just hire differently, they will lead differently. Inclusion isn't a program, it is a leadership behavior. And when diversity and inclusion work together, then that's when culture becomes a competitive advantage. Let's dive into the point number two of this episode: measuring DEI impact. Let's start with a story. Imagine two companies start DEI initiatives at the same time. Company A rolls out a few inclusive leadership classes. It celebrates a diversity on social media. Employees applaud. Company B does similar things, but 6 months later, they dig into the data. At Company A, representation hasn't moved much in leadership and retention is lower among underrepresented groups. At Company B, promotion gaps are narrowing and engagement scores are rising. What happened? The difference wasn't effort, it was measurement. Because you can launch DEI programs, but if you never measure their impact, you only have intentions, not results. DI measurement helps organizations answer questions like: are we hiring diverse talent? Are they staying? Are they advancing? Do they feel included and valued? These aren't fields based questions, they are data questions, and real impact only shows up when we track meaningful metrics. A few years ago, Starbucks published a transparent DEI report showing they had only 29% of employees identifying as Black, Indigenous, or people of color and set goals to improve diversity in hiring and retention. Through sustained focus and measurement, new hire representation climbed significantly, showing a clear link between actions and outcomes. This wasn't a feel good story, it was a data story. Similarly, Johnson & Johnson used data to uncover disparities in retention, especially among women of color. They didn't rely only on headcount, they analyzed who was staying, who was leaving, and why. Through this, J&J identified that retention wasn't equal across groups and then tied to specific interventions to improvement. This is a great example of measuring moving DEI from a checkbox to a strategy. Here are real metrics organizations use to measure DEI impact. Number one, representation metrics. Track diversity across the workforce, gender, ethnicity, age, disability, and especially in leadership and decision making roles. Point number two, hiring and promotion rates. Not just who you hire, but who gets advanced. If underrepresented groups are hired but not promoted, the pipeline leaks. Point number three, pay equity. Analyze whether people in similar roles and levels receive equitable pay regardless of identity, a core equity metric. Point number four, retention and turnover by demographics. Are diverse employees living faster than others? That is a sign inclusion still needs work. Point number five, inclusion and engagement scores. Surveys, sentiment feedback, and belonging indicators help capture how people feel, not just who's in the room. These numbers tell a story, and a story you can act on. Numbers are powerful, but they aren't everything. Some companies go a step further by combining quantitative data with narrative feedback. For example, if promotion data shows women of color are underrepresented in leadership, qualitative surveys and listening sessions can explain why. This combined approach reveals not just the what, but the why behind DEI challenges. It is the difference between tracking numbers and changing experiences. Here is a quick way to think about the metrics that drive change. Has the workforce become more diverse? Is the retention improving across all groups? Are promotions equitable? Are belonging and inclusion scores trending upward? Is pay equitable across demographics? If the answer to these moves from no toward yes over time, you are not just talking about DEI, you are delivering it. Measurement turns a DI into a strategic investment rather than a compliance checkbox. You know what is the good news about a DI? Measuring DI impact does more than show progress. It builds a trust, it drives accountability, and most importantly, it shows employers that inclusion isn't just something you say, it is something you prove. Bottom line is intent is where DEI begins, impact is where DEI thrives, and impact is only possible when we measure it. Because at the end of the day, what gets measured gets improved, not just in spreadsheets, but in people's everyday experiences. Let's look at point number 3 of this episode, bias in hiring and promotion. Let me start with a simple experiment. Two identical resumes are sent to employers, same education, same experience, same skills. The only difference, the name at the top. One says Emily, the other says Lakiksha. In a landmark study by economists at MIT and the University of Chicago, resumes with a traditionally white sounding names received significantly more callbacks than those with black sounding names, even though the qualifications were identical. Same capability, different outcome. That is bias. And it doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers. In the 70s and 80s, major orchestras across the US faced criticism. Very few women were being selected for top ensembles. Leaders believed auditions were purely merit based. After all, musicians performed behind a panel. But then something changed. They introduced blind auditions. Musicians performed behind a screen so judges couldn't see them. What was the result? The likelihood of women advancing increased dramatically. Nothing about skill change, only visibility did. Bias wasn't necessarily intentional, but it was real. When visibility disappeared, merit spoke louder. Now let's move to corporate hiring. Think about how interviews often go. We just clicked, she reminds me of myself, he would fit our culture, sounds harmless, right? But culture fit can easily become similar to me and a similarity bias. Hiring people who look like us, think like us, or share our background quietly narrows a diversity. This is something companies like Google have publicly acknowledged. Early in its growth, Google noticed interviews relied heavily on gut feeling. Over time, they shifted towards structured interviews, standardized scoring rubrics, and data based evaluation because they learned something critical. Unstructured interviews amplify bias, structured ones reduce it. Hiring bias is visible, promotion bias is often hidden. Let's talk about a pattern seen in many organizations. Men are often promoted based on potential, women are often promoted based on proven performance. Studies have shown that women and underrepresented groups are frequently required to prove it again before being advanced. This doesn't happen because managers intend to discriminate. It happens because of unconscious expectations. At companies like Intel, leadership began measuring promotion rates by gender and ethnicity. They discovered disparities, not dramatic, but consistent. And consistency is what reveals a systematic bias. Intel tied executive compensation to diversity goals and promotion equity metrics. That accountability shifted behavior. Because when leadership is measured on fairness, fairness becomes a priority. Performance reviews are another common entry point for bias. Research has shown that women are more likely to receive weak personality based feedback like be more confident, watch your tone, while men more often receive skills based feedback, improve strategic planning, develop technical expertise. One is actionable, the other is subjective. Companies like Adobe, when they eliminated annual performance reviews, didn't just change the frequency of feedback, they focused on coaching conversations with clear criteria to reduce the subjectivity. Bias often hides in ambiguity, clarity exposes it. Bias isn't just a social issue, it is a business issue. When talent is overlooked because of assumptions, organizations lose capability. When promotion decisions are influenced by comfort rather than competence, leadership pipelines weaken. And when employees feel overlooked, engagement drops. Gallup research consistently shows that perceived unfairness directly impacts employee engagement and retention. Bias affects culture, culture affects performance. Companies serious about minimizing bias typically do five things. Point number one, use structured interviews with standardized questions. Point number two, implement diverse hiring panels. Point number three, analyze hiring and promotion data by demographics. Point number four, train managers on unconscious bias. Point number five, define clear performance criteria tied to measurable outcomes. None of these eliminate bias completely, but they interrupt it, and interruption is progress. Here is the part we don't always talk about. Bias doesn't just affect statistics, it affects confidence. Imagine consistently being overlooked. Imagine being told you are not quite ready without clear explanation. Imagine watching peers advance faster. Over time, that shapes how people see themselves. That is why inclusion isn't just about bringing people in, it is about ensuring they can move forward fairly. So, the bottom line is bias in hiring and promotion isn't always loud or malicious. Often it is invisible. It lives in assumptions, in comfort, and in familiarity. The organizations that succeed in the long term aren't the ones that claim to be unbiased. They are the ones that design systems strong enough to reduce bias, even when humans are imperfect. Because when opportunity becomes truly merit based, talent rises, and when talent rises, organizations rise with it. Let's dive into the point number four of this episode, psychological safety. Let me start with a scene. A team meeting, senior leaders at the table, a risky product launch on the agenda. Everyone nods, deadlines are tight, concerns exist, but no one says anything. 2 months later, the launch fails, and someone quietly admits, I actually saw this coming. That moment, that silence is the opposite of a psychological safety. A few years ago, Google launched a major internal study called Project Aristotle. They wanted to answer one question: what makes a team effective? They analyzed hundreds of teams. They expected to find that the best teams had the smartest people, or the best managers, or the most resources. They were wrong. The number one factor wasn't intelligence, it wasn't seniority, it wasn't experience, it was psychological safety. Teams performed best when members felt safe to speak up, safe to admit mistakes, safe to challenge ideas, and safe to say, I don't know. That safety unlocked performance. Now let's go to Pixar. Pixar's creative process includes something called the brain trust. Directors present early versions of films, often messy, incomplete drafts. The room gives brutally honest feedback. But here is the key: the feedback is candid but not political. No one fears punishment for speaking truth. When Toy Story 2 was struggling in production, the team openly admitted it wasn't working. They scrapped major portions and rebuilt it. That kind of honesty requires safety. If people feared embarrassment or retaliation, they would have pretended everything was fine. Psychological safety protects excellence. Let's shift industries now. In healthcare, silence can be deadly. Research in hospitals showed that teams where nurses felt safe to question doctors made fewer medical errors. But interestingly, hospitals with higher reported error rates sometimes had better cultures because people felt safe reporting mistakes. In unsafe environments, errors go unreported. In safe environments, errors get fixed. Silence hides problems, Safety exposes them early. Let's clarify something important. Psychological safety is not about lowering standards. It is not about avoiding accountability. It is not about being nice all the time. You can have high standards and high safety. In fact, the best performing teams have both. Low safety plus high standards is equal to anxiety. Safety plus low standards is equal to comfort without growth. High safety plus high standards is equal to excellence. That is the sweet spot. Now imagine the opposite, a workplace where questions are seen as a weakness, mistakes are punished for harshly, leaders shut down dissent, only the loudest voices are heard. What happens then? People stop speaking, innovation slows down, risk taking disappears, engagement drops. Gallup research consistently links fear based environments to lower engagement and higher turnover. When people feel unsafe, they protect themselves. When they feel safe, they contribute fully. Companies that build psychological safety do a few intentional things. Point number one, leader admit mistakes publicly. Point number two, meetings invite dissenting opinions. Point number three, feedback is normalized and frequent. Point number four, failure is treated as learning. Point number five, questions are rewarded, not dismissed. It starts at the top. If a leader reacts defensively to feedback once, the room remembers. Safety can take months to build and one moment to destroy. Remember it. At its core, psychological safety is about belonging. It is about being able to say, I disagree, I'm struggling, I need help, I have an idea, without fear of embarrassment. When people feel safe, they don't just work harder, they think better, collaborate deeper, take smarter risks. They bring their full sleeves to the table. Bottom line is psychological safety isn't a soft concept, it is a performance multiplier. Companies like Google, Pixar, and Microsoft didn't build strong cultures by accident. They created environments where speaking up wasn't dangerous, it was expected. Because in today's world, the biggest risk isn't disagreement, it is silence. And the organizations that eliminate silence unlock their greatest potential. Let's dive into point number 5 of this episode, why inclusive cultures outperform. Let me start with the two companies. Both hire smart people, both invest in technology, both have strong strategies, but one consistently innovates faster, retains the talent longer, adapts better during crisis. What is the difference between these two companies? Inclusion. That's the only answer. Not diversity alone, inclusion. Decade ago, Microsoft had a reputation for internal competition. Teams worked in silos, leaders guarded territory. The culture was sharp but not always collaborative. When Satya Nadella became CEO, he didn't just change his strategy, he changed culture. He pushed a growth mindset, empathy, curiosity, cross team collaboration. He emphasized listening. Under this more inclusive culture, something powerful happened then. Innovation accelerated, cloud revenue exploded, market values soared, inclusion created psychological safety. Psychological safety fueled experimentation, and experimentation drove performance. Inclusive cultures don't just feel better, they execute better. Now let's look at L'Oreal. Operating in over 150 countries, L'Oreal realized that beauty isn't one size fits all. Different skin tones, cultures, and preferences require different solutions. But you can't build global products with one dimensional teams. So, L'Oreal intentionally built diverse and inclusive innovation teams. Researchers from different cultural backgrounds work together to understand what local needs. What was the result then? Products are designed for specific markets performed better because they reflected real customer insights. When your workforce mirrors your customer base and when those voices are truly heard, performance improves. Inclusion sharpens relevance. Research from McKinsey and Company consistently shows that companies in the top quartile for diversity are more likely to outperform financially. But here is the nuance. Diversity alone doesn't drive performance. Inclusion does. You can hire diverse talent, but if those voices are ignored, sidelined, or silenced, the performance advantage disappears. Inclusive cultures convert diversity into impact. At Pixar, the creative process depends on inclusion. In the brain trust meetings, filmmakers present early versions of movies and receive open critique. But anyone, regardless of title, can challenge ideas. The environment encourages a dissent and not hierarchy. Why? Because the best ideas don't always come from the highest title in the room. By allowing all voices to contribute, Pixar refines ideas early and avoids costly creative failures. Inclusion fuels creative excellence. Deloitte studied what makes employees stay and thrive. They found that when employees feel included, meaning respected, heard, and valued, engagement increases significantly. And engagement correlates strongly with productivity and retention. Think about the cost of turnover. Now imagine reducing that cost simply by building cultures where people feel like they belong. Inclusion isn't just ethical, it is economical. Here is what inclusive cultures unlock: better decision making, faster innovation, higher engagement, stronger employer brand, greater silence. Now imagine the opposite: a culture where certain voices dominate, a junior employees hesitate to speak, diverse perspectives are dismissed, and leaders only listen to people who agree with them. Innovation narrows, risk increases, turnover rises quietly. Exclusion creates echo chambers, and echo chambers kill adaptability. At its core, inclusion answers one simple question for every employee: do I belong here? When people feel they belong, they share ideas, they take initiative, they collaborate, they stay. When they don't, they disengage or they leave. So, bottom line is inclusive cultures outperform because they maximize human potential. Companies like Microsoft, L'Oreal, Pixar, and Deloitte show that inclusion isn't a side initiative, it is a performance strategy. It transforms diversity from a statistic into a strength. In today's complex, global, fast moving economy, no single perspective is enough. The organizations that win are the ones that invite more voices, listen carefully, and act boldly. Because when everyone contributes, the company doesn't just grow, it evolves. Let me conclude this episode of a Beer HR series. We explore why inclusion, not just diversity, drives real business performance. Through examples from Microsoft, L'Oreal, Pixar, and Deloitte, we unpack how inclusive cultures fuel innovation, engagement, better decision making, and long term growth. Because belonging isn't soft, it is strategic. Thank you so much.